So you wrote this interesting article entitled Why Zelensky Must Go. Why must he go?
Well, I think he's lost President Trump's trust, for one thing, and there's also, I think, become too much of an intermixture of Zelensky's own pride and his own reputation with the cause of his country and with the state of the war itself. And so you've mixed up the personal with the professional and the personal with the military here, and I think that's going to be bad for Ukraine, and it's bad for allies who are trying to help Ukraine, because Zelensky, I think, is standing in the way and complicating matters.
Some people in Europe say that President Trump is appeasing Vladimir Putin as if this is the late 1930s. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I mean, obviously, we have been supplying Ukraine with the means to defend against Vladimir Putin for many years now. We've reached a point where the war is virtually a stalemate. And if it goes on, the Ukrainians are not going to be in a better position to ask for more than what they can get right now. So this is the best time to call off the war, to strike the best peace bargain possible. If it continues, you're either going to get simply more killing and then the same deal at the end of the day, or you'll actually get a worse deal, because again, Russia is a much bigger country with many more resources in terms of manpower, in terms of the ability simply to intimidate its neighbor. This is the best time to strike a deal, and certainly President Trump's deal for minerals is something that would have ended the war on conditions that would have been that would have made it very difficult for Russia to pursue future aggression against Ukraine.
Zelensky would argue that he is incredibly popular still in Ukraine, if you look at opinion polls, and he's just fighting for his country's sovereignty, and he's essentially fighting for Ukraine's interests.
The best test of that is, of course, an election, and Zelensky is not going to call an election, so it's impossible to say whether he has the backing of his countrymen or not at this point. And, when you have a leader who lacks democratic legitimacy, it's very difficult to say whether he's acting in the interests of the people and of his country, or if he's acting simply according to his own whims.
Why should it be up to the US as to who is the leader of Ukraine?
Well, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So if we are going to be primarily on the hook for the money and the arms and the intelligence that Ukrainians need, they do have to listen to our advice. But beyond that, it's not really a matter of the U.S. being responsible for telling Ukraine how to run its government. It's rather, are the Ukrainians themselves going to be satisfied with a leader who is unaccountable to democratic opinion, especially when something as controversial as a peace deal is being struck? We in America had elections during our Civil War. We even had elections during our Revolutionary War, when you had British troops in our own country. In places like Virginia, for example, we still had elections for governor, despite the fact that it was partly militarily occupied. So you certainly can have elections during wartime, and I think the Ukrainians would benefit from having an election and letting the full spectrum of opinion in their country be represented in their electoral process.
When it comes to US foreign policy, does it matter that Putin was the one who invaded Ukraine? Should morality come into considerations?
It does matter, but it's not going to win the war. So you can't simply say that because Putin is the aggressor and Putin is bad, both of which are absolutely true, that therefore he's going to lose the war, or that simply showering money and arms on Ukraine is going to be sufficient to win the war for them. Instead, the key thing that has to be done now is to make sure that Ukraine doesn't suffer greater losses, both in terms of human beings fighting the war right now, and also, if this war goes on longer, there's more and more of a chance that more Ukrainian territory is going to be lost. So again, the prudent decision here is to try to strike a deal that will terminate the war, that will, it's not going to be, the best deal ever. It's not going to, restore Crimea to Ukraine, but it could stanch the bleeding right now, and it could create security conditions for the future for Ukraine that would actually be very good for the country in the long term.
Senator Mike Lee tweeted recently that the US should leave NATO. Elon Musk agreed with him on Twitter, or X. Do you agree with that assessment?
I certainly wouldn't agree with leaving NATO in a hurry, but I do think we have to take very seriously the idea that Europe should be primarily responsible for its own security. And if that were the case, I think the Ukrainian war would not have happened in the first place. I think a stronger Europe would have been able to deter Russia in a way that a Europe wholly dependent on a very remote sort of United States to bail things out, I think that was a condition that was insecure and that actually created conditions that allowed Russia to invade Ukraine. So I think European security primarily will depend on Europeans in the future. And NATO, to the extent that it continues, the U.S. should be less of the central, financier and military force behind NATO, and instead should be a backstop or an insurance policy, with the Europeans taking the primary lead for their own continent.
When this row broke out in the Oval Office between Zelensky, Trump, and J.D. Vance, who do you think was at fault for that beginning?
Well, it was entirely Zelensky's fault. So if you watch the full 40 minutes of that press conference, that Oval Office ceremony, you'll see that Zelensky was constantly sort of nibbling around the edges and doing things that were annoying President Trump and J.D. Vance until it finally escalated and blew up and wound up becoming a diplomatic disaster. And Zelensky, by the way, has a reputation for doing this. So the Biden team also became extremely frustrated with Zelensky at various points, which is another reason I just think temperamentally he may have been the right man to be steadfast in 2022 and to not leave the country as it was being invaded by Russia. But he does not have a diplomatic temperament, and he does not have a temperament for looking forward to a peace deal as opposed to looking forward to simply more ongoing conflict, even without a chance of winning.
After that exchange in the White House, European leaders rallied around Zelensky, and lots of people in Europe said that J.D. Vance and Trump were bullying Zelensky. What do you make of the European reaction to that exchange?
Well, I'm afraid it's rather typical. So European leaders will talk a very good game, but they won't actually play that game. They won't actually put up very much money. They certainly won't put up troops. They are in a position where they get to feel as if they are moralists who can preach at the whole world, including America, including any place on the planet. And yet, when it comes to actually taking responsibility and doing things, the Europeans rather always fall short. And I'm afraid the Ukrainians are paying the price for that because their lives are the ones on the line.
Do you think there's a moral equivalence between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky?
No, Putin is a much worse character in every respect. So it's not a matter of, calling each one a dictator or saying that each one is democratically unaccountable. Zelensky, I would not say is exactly a dictator, but he is democratically unaccountable right now. There is no way to take account of the Ukrainians who want peace, the Ukrainians who want to strike a deal sooner rather than later. So you're not getting the kind of democratic feedback that you should get in the most crucial decisions that a country makes. And so there really is a question here. It's not simply, a matter of labels. It's a matter of, does democracy actually serve a good purpose? Is it something that's important for a country to have? Or can we simply say that whatever Zelensky wants to do is going to be, an adequate decision for his whole country? And it seems to me that based on his record in the past, certainly several weeks and months, but even over the past couple of years, Zelensky has not been bringing Ukraine into a better and better position. He has, at best, kind of frozen it into a conflict in which Ukrainians are dying steadily. And at worst, I fear that he's created a diplomatic and strategic situation that's going to collapse Ukraine's fortunes in the next several months here.
There are some on the American right who do view those two people as, essentially evil dictators on the same level. And, they'll criticize Ukraine, but sometimes perhaps they don't criticize Russia in the same way. Where do you think President Trump is? I know that, again, I mentioned there are people who say that, America should leave NATO and so on. Where do you think he is on that kind of spectrum of isolationism versus neocon hawkishism?
Well, Trump sees NATO as being a bad financial agreement, and he sees it as being a matter of America being taken advantage of by Europeans who are not paying for their own defense. And in terms of the Ukraine conflict, I think he recognizes actually, and it was somewhat, misreported, this claim that he said that it was Ukraine invading Russia. That wasn't exactly what he said. But I do think he sees this as being a dispute over land, a dispute over, degrees of opinion in places like Crimea, which may in fact not be simply 100% in one direction or the other. So Trump views this in much more, I shouldn't say material terms, but in terms of interests that, have to be negotiated and are not simply a matter of imposing or taking a moralistic view of things from the get-go. Whereas obviously, other people, and this, includes Europeans who, look at the moral question and say, aha, well, that's all that matters, therefore we should do whatever we need to for Ukraine. That's one perspective. But then, as you mentioned, there are these people on the American right who take a moralistic position of their own, saying that, well, we don't like some of the things Zelensky's doing, therefore he's a dictator, and therefore he's equally bad as Putin, and, that's the lens through which they view this. I think Trump is neither of those positions. Trump is actually much more focused on interests and things that can be negotiated and actually settled.
The Europeans were very shocked when Trump had this exchange with Zelensky, and I think they're just generally quite outraged by President Trump's position on the war in Ukraine. Do you think that the Europeans misunderstand American public opinion? Because in their countries, people are very much supportive of Ukraine in a way that perhaps in America it's not the same.
Well, I fear that the Europeans even misunderstand public opinion in their own countries as well, and we see that with the rise of populist movements, throughout the continent. And now clearly those movements are not yet majoritarian, and it may be the case that majorities in their countries are still very supportive of the current direction of the Ukraine war. But it seems to me that there is a very significant amount of public opinion throughout Europe which says maybe this is not going so well, maybe we need, a change in our approach. And the trouble is, America was in that kind of position with the Afghanistan war, which went on for 20 years. And public opinion, the dissenting element in public opinion was just ignored in election cycle after election cycle. And the result of that was that more and more discontent built up until finally there was enough of it to elect Donald Trump in 2016 and then to re-elect him in 2024. Europe is on that same path. And the more that Europe, puts its money and its men on the line in these conflicts without having a broad enough base of support, not just a majority, but a very large supermajority, you're going to wind up with a larger and larger populist backlash in Europe, which is going to basically produce European versions of Donald Trump. And already we're starting to see a little bit of that. So I think the Europeans should really take this opportunity to look at what's happened in America and say, yes, it will happen here, unless we strike a more reasonable, negotiating, and moderate position.